cold morning in Wilmington, Delaware, Joe Biden walks through familiar streets when a man emerges from the shadows. A forgotten war veteran, marked by the scars of combat and years living on the streets. What seems like just another casual encounter transforms into a confrontation that unearths truths buried for decades. The veteran is not there by chance. He carries a secret that connects his destiny to Biden's in a way no one could imagine. A revelation that will make Biden question everything he believes he knows about his past, about promises made, and about the true cost of political decisions that affect real lives. This is a story about unpaid debts, forgotten loyalty, and the courage to face ghosts that should never have been abandoned. What this veteran has to say will change everything. And you need to know what happens when the past finally catches up with the present. It was a particularly cold December morning, the kind that cuts through skin like ice blades. Wilmington, Delaware was slowly waking up. The historic streets of Market Street displayed the architecture that had witnessed decades of transformations. The red brick buildings, the Victorian-style street lamps, the old shops that had served the community for generations. Joe Biden walked alone, something rare in his routine. He observed the buildings that held his childhood memories, the corner where he used to buy newspapers as a boy, the barbershop where his father took him every Saturday. Every brick, every window seemed to whisper stories from another time. He was immersed in thoughts when a figure emerged from a narrow alley between two old buildings. A man of devastating appearance, with torn clothes that barely protected him from the intense cold. His graying and disheveled beard covered a face marked by years of harsh living. His hands trembled, not just from the weather. In those calloused hands, he held a photograph yellowed by time. The image was barely visible, but he clutched it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Biden prepared himself for what he imagined would be another request for help on the streets. He had encountered countless homeless people throughout his career, always trying to offer a kind word, sometimes a few dollars. But this man did not extend his hand asking for alms. Instead, his eyes fixed on Biden's with a disturbing intensity. The look was not of desperation or supplication. It was something deeper. Something that made Biden's heart accelerate without him understanding why. The man spoke in a hoarse voice, damaged by years of neglect and probably alcohol. But despite the roughness, his words were clear and deliberate. He pronounced a name that Biden had not heard in 40 years, Danny Sullivan. Biden felt his legs weaken. That name carried the weight of buried memories. Memories he had pushed to the back of his mind, covered by decades of political campaigns, legislative sessions, international trips, and the relentless machinery of public life. The man identified himself as Thomas Sullivan, Danny's brother, and he said he needed to talk about a promise Biden had made decades ago before Danny died on the battlefields of Vietnam, a promise that was never fulfilled. The cold wind of Delaware seemed to intensify, but Biden no longer felt it. All he felt was the crushing weight of that name resonating in his mind like an endless echo. Danny Sullivan, Vietnam, 1975, a military hospital, a dying young man, a promise made hell. Biden felt a tightness in his chest. He invited Thomas to a nearby coffee shop, a small family establishment that had served the community for generations. The Wilmington Coffee House, with its wooden tables worn by time and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that had comforted generations of Delaware residents. The warmth of the environment contrasted with the cold Biden felt inside. They sat face to face at a table in the back, away from curious eyes. Thomas's hands continued to tremble as he carefully placed the yellowed photograph on the table. Biden looked at the image. Two young men in military uniform, smiling at the camera with that mixture of courage and fear that only soldiers about to go to war possess. One of them was clearly Thomas, decades younger, with a full face and hopeful eyes. The other was Danny. Thomas began to unfold the story he had carried like an open wound for decades. He took a worn envelope from his tattered coat. Inside, handwritten letters. Letters that Danny Sullivan had sent home in 1975 in the last days of his life. Biden remembered with painful clarity. He was a young senator visiting troops in Vietnam. It was one of those official visits that politicians made to show support for the troops, to be photographed with soldiers, to return home and talk about their bravery. But something happened during that visit that Biden had never forgotten, even though he had tried. Danny Sullivan was on a field hospital stretcher, seriously wounded. Shrapnel had destroyed much of his abdomen. The doctors knew he would not survive, but they kept him comfortable with morphine while waiting for the inevitable. Biden had approached the stretcher. Danny's eyes already carried the certainty of the approaching death, but there was something else in them. A desperate need to believe that his sacrifice meant something, that his brothers in arms would be cared for when they returned home. Biden, touched by the wasted youth of that soldier, had held his hand and made a solemn promise. He swore he would take care of veterans' families. He guaranteed that soldiers like him would have all the necessary support when they returned home. Medical treatment, psychological therapy, job assistance, housing. Everything they deserved for having sacrificed so much. Danny wrote about that promise in his letters. He wrote with hope that his brother Thomas, who was also fighting in the war, would be cared for when he returned. He wrote with the peace of knowing that his sacrifice would not be in vain, that the politician who held his hand and looked into his eyes was a man of his word. But Danny died 3 days later, and his body was sent home in a flag-covered coffin. Thomas attended the funeral, his own body marked by scars from combat, his mind already beginning to show the cracks that would later widen into chasms. Thomas revealed his trajectory of suffering. When he returned from Vietnam, he was not the same man who had left. The nights were filled with nightmares. The sounds of fireworks made him dive for cover. He could not hold down a job because panic attacks struck without warning. He sought help in the channels Biden had promised to create. He went to Veterans Affairs offices. He filled out endless forms. He attended appointments with doctors who seemed more interested in moving him through the system than in understanding his pain. The bureaucracy was interminable. Documents got lost in drawers of government offices. Functionaries made empty promises and disappeared. Appointments were scheduled and canceled without explanation. The treatment that was promised never materialized consistently. Gradually, Thomas fell through the cracks of the system. He lost his job because employers grew tired of his absences for medical appointments that led nowhere. He lost his apartment because without a job, he could not pay rent. He lost contact with friends and family because the shame of his situation was unbearable. The streets became his home. The same streets he had fought to protect, the same country he had served with honor, now offered him nothing but cold concrete and the indifference of passersby who avoided his eyes. Biden absorbed each word like blows. His throat was tight. His eyes burned. How many promises had he made throughout his career? How many handshakes? How many looks in the eyes? How many solemn words spoken in moments of emotion? And how many of those promises had been lost in the relentless whirlwind of politics, buried under new campaigns, new priorities, new crises demanding attention? Thomas looked at him with an expression that was not hatred, but something perhaps worse, disappointment. The disappointment of a man who had believed, who had held onto hope even as everything crumbled around him, and who finally had to accept that the promise was empty. What do you think about what you have seen so far? Do you believe that politicians should be held accountable for promises made decades ago? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Thomas continued his narrative, and each revelation was more devastating than the last. He pulled more documents from his coat, each one a piece of a puzzle of systemic abandonment. Letters returned unopened, appointment cancellation notices, medical reports suggesting treatments that were never approved. But there was something more, something that would make Biden question everything he thought he knew about the impact of his political decisions. Thomas had had a daughter, Sarah Sullivan. Biden listened as Thomas described his little girl. She was born a year after he returned from Vietnam. Her mother, Thomas's girlfriend before the war, tried to make the relationship work. But Thomas was too destroyed, too consumed by nightmares and traumas, incapable of being the father and partner they deserved. The relationship ended when Sarah was only 3 years old. Her mother tried to raise the girl alone, but the absence of a functional father left deep marks. Sarah grew up knowing her father was alive but unable to be present in her life. She grew up seeing him on the streets sometimes, barely recognizing the broken man who was supposed to protect her. As Sarah grew older, she tried desperately to get help for her father. She was a determined young woman, refusing to accept that the system could abandon a war veteran. When she turned 18, she began a personal campaign to get treatment for Thomas. She wrote letters to Senator Biden's office, detailed letters explaining her father's situation, his service in Vietnam, the promise that had been made. She called countless times, navigating automated menus, waiting on hold for hours, talking to assistants who noted her information and promised someone would return her call. Those calls never came. The letters were never answered. Each attempt ended in frustration, in the growing understanding that for the political machinery, her father was just another statistic, another file among thousands, easily ignorable. Thomas pulled another document from his coat's inner pocket. His hands trembled more intensely now, and Biden noticed tears beginning to form in the corners of the veteran's eyes. It was a death certificate. Sarah Sullivan had died 3 years ago. The cause of death was listed as opioid overdose. She was only 32 years old. Thomas explained with a broken voice. Sarah had fallen into her own cycle of pain. The frustration of not being able to help her father, combined with her own traumas from growing up without a functional parent, had led her down a dark path. She began using pain medication for a back injury. The medication became a dependency. The dependency became an addiction. She tried to get help, but the same system that had failed her father also failed her. Waiting lists for rehabilitation programs were months long. When she finally got into a program, the 30-day treatment was insufficient for her deep dependency. She relapsed within weeks of leaving. Thomas had found her in a motel room. She was already cold. Next to her body was a letter addressed to him. In the letter, Sarah apologized for not being strong enough. She apologized for not being able to save him. She said she loved him and hoped he could find peace. Thomas looked deeply into Biden's eyes and said words that would echo in his soul forever. He did not directly blame Biden for his daughter's death. He understood that life was complex, that many factors contributed to tragedy. But the systematic indifference, the unfulfilled promises, the ignored letters, each abandoned veteran, all of this had real consequences. Consequences with names, faces, destroyed lives. Biden felt the crushing weight of responsibility. There, before him, was not just a homeless veteran. It was the personification of decades of political failures. The human face behind the statistics he cited in speeches without truly seeing the suffering behind the numbers. Thank you so much for staying with this story until now. Your attention means everything. And believe me, the best is yet to come. The conversation in the coffee shop began to attract attention. The establishment, usually quiet in the morning, now buzzed with whispers. People recognized Biden. In the age of smartphones, recognition meant immediate documentation. Someone pulled out their cell phone and started filming. The video captured Biden and Thomas at the table, documents spread between them, the veteran's emotional expression, Biden's visible distress. Within minutes, the scene went viral on social networks. The caption read, "Former Vice President of the United States being confronted by homeless veteran on Delaware streets." Biden's phones exploded with calls from frantic advisors, notifications piled up, text messages in all caps, urgent emails. The media was on its way. Local news teams mobilized quickly. Within 20 minutes, television vans were parking outside the coffee shop. The pressure increased with each passing second. Advisors called with the same message, leave immediately. They would mount a controlled narrative, minimize the impact, transform everything into just another passing controversy. They would issue a statement expressing concern for all veterans, announce a review of policies, promise improvements. The standard political machinery. But Biden remained seated, looking at Thomas. The veteran showed no interest in momentary money or fame. Cameras filming through the coffee shop windows did not seem to affect him. He wanted something much deeper and more difficult: recognition. He wanted Biden to publicly admit that the system had failed, that he had failed. Not just an abstract acknowledgement in a carefully worded statement, but a real, human-direct admission, face-to-face with the man he had failed. Thomas's words were simple but devastating. All he wanted was to hear the truth. He wanted Biden to admit he had failed him, failed Danny, failed Sarah. That the system Biden helped build and maintain had abandoned them when they needed it most. The crowd on the street increased rapidly. News vans parked in a line. Reporters prepared microphones and cameras. Curious onlookers gathered, phones held high, recording everything. The scene had all the elements of a political crisis about to explode. Inside the coffee shop, the owner looked nervous. This was more attention than his small establishment had ever received. Customers whispered among themselves, some sympathetic to Thomas, others defending Biden, most simply curious about what would happen next. Biden's advisors continued calling. Some were already outside, trying to push through the growing crowd. They gestured desperately through the window, signaling for him to leave immediately. Drivers prepared the car for a quick escape. The crucial moment had arrived. Biden was at a crossroads that would define not just that day, but possibly the legacy of his entire career. He could rise and leave, let his team handle the situation, return to the controlled safety of official statements and political spin. Or he could stay and face that painful truth publicly, in front of cameras, in front of the world. Biden took a deep breath. The cold Delaware air filled his lungs. Outside, his advisors gestured desperately, pleading for him to leave immediately. The drivers had already started the cars. Escape routes were planned. Within seconds, he could be gone, and his team would begin damage control. Television cameras rolled, capturing every movement. The world was watching in real time. Live streams multiplied across social platforms. Commentary sections filled with opinions, debates, arguments. Some defended Biden, citing his long career of public service. Others condemned him, pointing to systemic failures that affected thousands of veterans. Biden could easily escape that situation. His advisors were experts at this. They would mount a controlled narrative, release a statement expressing deep concern for all veterans, announce an immediate review of Veterans Affairs policies, promise substantial improvements. In a few days, the news cycle would move on to the next controversy. It always did. But something had changed inside Biden that cold morning. Maybe it was Thomas's eyes, carrying decades of pain and disappointment. Maybe it was the memory of Danny Sullivan dying on that field hospital stretcher. Maybe it was the image of Sarah Sullivan, a young woman destroyed by a system that should have protected her family. Or maybe it was simply the accumulation of years of political compromises, of promises bent to fit political realities, of ideal, as gradually eroded by the machinery of governance. Maybe it was the rare moment of clarity that sometimes comes in life, when a person sees themselves truly reflected in the consequences of their choices. Biden stood up. His advisors, thinking he was finally leaving, relaxed slightly. But instead of walking toward the door, Biden walked toward the front window. He gestured for someone to open it. Confused, one of the coffee shop employees complied. Biden took a microphone from a nearby reporter. The crowd hushed, sensing something significant was about to happen. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice when he spoke was steady and clear. He spoke directly to the cameras, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas Sullivan, who stood beside him. Biden publicly admitted his failure. He admitted he had failed Thomas, had failed Danny, had failed Sarah. He acknowledged he had failed thousands of veterans who fell through the cracks of a system he promised to fix but never adequately repaired. There were no prepared notes, no carefully crafted talking points from advisors. It was raw honesty, the kind rarely heard in modern politics. He detailed how easy it was for politicians to make promises in emotional moments, how those promises often got lost in the complexity of bureaucracy and the constant demands for new priorities. He spoke about the human cost of political abstractions. Every policy decision, every budget cut, every delayed program affected real people with real families and real suffering. He had known this intellectually throughout his career, but standing there on a Wilmington street, facing Thomas Sullivan, he felt it viscerally for perhaps the first time. The raw honesty, without filters, silenced the agitated crowd. These were not the rehearsed words of an experienced politician. It was the genuine confession of a man confronting his own failures. Some in the crowd began to cry. Others stood in stunned silence. Even the most cynical reporters found themselves moved. But Biden did not stop at admission. There, in front of the cameras with the whole world witnessing, he announced the creation of an emergency fund for homeless veterans in Delaware, starting with a substantial donation from his own money. He publicly committed to personally reviewing each case of veterans who had tried to contact his office over the last 40 years. He called on other political leaders to do the same, to look beyond statistics and see the human faces behind every policy failure. He challenged the Veterans Affairs system to radical reform, promising to use whatever influence he still possessed to ensure real change. Thomas Sullivan, for the first time in decades, cried. But these were not tears of pain or despair. They were tears of relief. Someone had finally listened. Someone finally truly cared. The acknowledgement he had sought for so long had finally come. Biden and Thomas embraced while cameras captured the moment. It was not a perfect fairy tale ending. The embrace would not erase decades of suffering. It would not bring back Sarah. It would not cure Thomas's physical and psychological scars. It would not undo the systematic failures that had affected thousands of veterans. But it was the imperfect and difficult beginning of redemption. It was the start of a promise that this time would be fulfilled under the watchful eyes of the entire world. And sometimes, that imperfect beginning is all we can hope for. A genuine acknowledgement of failure and the courage to try to make things right, even when it is decades too late. This story makes us reflect on the power of promises and the devastating weight of consequences when we forget them. Every political decision has a human face behind it. Every law passed or rejected affects real lives, real families, real destinies. How do we ensure that those who sacrifice everything for their country are never forgotten? How do we hold ourselves accountable for the promises we make, not just politicians, but all of us in our daily lives? What obligations do we have to those whose suffering we could alleviate but choose to ignore? What do you think about this story? Should leaders be held accountable for old promises? How can we ensure that veterans are never forgotten? Leave your opinion in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the Emotional Journeys channel for more stories that make you think, feel, and reflect on the human condition. And do not miss the next recommended video where we reveal another impactful story you need to know. Thomas sat calmly, waiting. He had waited decades. He could wait a few more minutes. His eyes never left Biden's face, reading every micro-expression, every sign of internal struggle.